Welcome to AP European History Unit 6, our very first lesson, Industrialization and etc. So Unit 6 in AP Euro is going to cover these four main topics, including the First Industrial Revolution, the Second Industrial Revolution, the concert of Europe and the battle between liberalism and conservatism, and some new isms, including socialism, Marxism, communism, anarchism, all the best of the isms. All of those in response to the Industrial Revolution and the battles between liberalism and conservatism. So let's start with some big ideas, some big things to think about as you're thinking about the Industrial Revolution and the isms that come after. First of all, it was not an overnight revolution. This did not happen instantaneously. It was a long process. You can trace it all the way back to the revival of trade in the late Middle Ages, up through the Renaissance. But ultimately, it's revolutionary because of the long-term changes, the immense changes that it makes to the way people live, where they live, the products they use. It will ultimately change levels of prosperity in ways that we see today as very, very positive. People having a lot more stuff, living longer, living in bigger and better houses. But even those we'll see negative counterparts to them. It also led to a lot of new ways in thinking about the world, including family, government, God, other countries. Look at this picture down here. This is a very famous picture of children working in a textile factory here in Georgia, Macon, Georgia, 1909. The thing about this was fairly normal in 1909. There were a lot of critics by the early 1900s of using children in factories like this. But go back 200 years, before the Industrial Revolution, every family considered it to be normal to employ their children. As soon as they could hold an axe, they were chopping wood. As soon as they could hold a cast iron pan, they were cooking lunch or dinner. As soon as they could help in the blacksmith shop, they were helping in the blacksmith shop. That was considered to be the normal way of doing things. Today we look at this, and it's shocking to see a very small child working in dangerous machinery, knowing that many of them died, many of them were injured, and we can't see that as right. So what changed? Was it simply the Industrial Revolution drove children into factories, which was much more dangerous, and we decided maybe not to do that? What else could have changed? What was the first philosophical group that started seeing children as a special protected class? That maybe their lives should not be all work and no play. So consider that. Do you remember what group it was? Who had suggested that maybe children should spend their time in play as opposed to doing work? If you said Rousseau and the Romantics, who came after them, you were correct. So what was this? A basic definition of the Industrial Revolution is this transition from local, small craftspeople, your local blacksmith, making some horseshoes, using, usually for him, human power, sometimes a little bit of water power in a blacksmith shop, to a centralized production where a factory using steam power creates a mass-produced horseshoes in various sizes. So you're seeing the centralization of economic activity moving from small local craftsmen and families to a large industrial enterprise. So where you may have been working with a small family and a couple helpers, now you're employing 500 people. A lot of people, especially in the past 50 years, have started questioning whether the revolution was a good thing overall. But even as it was happening, people were asking, is this a good thing? Is it good to move people from work in their homes into an industrial setting where they may ultimately make more money and be more prosperous and have more things for their homes? Prices of goods will go down. Is that worth losing the familial industrial workspace? working with your family all day. Does our experience that we've seen lately lead us to even question more the Industrial Revolution? Certainly as we are experiencing a pandemic based upon international trade, international relations, industrial revolution, it has echoes of the Black Death, right? Where trade and the growth of European trade led to a pandemic. Is that a good thing? Is it better that we're home, working now with our families? And even bigger, people have questioned the Industrial Revolution in terms of, well, what about climate change? How does what the Industrial Revolution has done to our world, is it worth having the iPhones and the computers and the large screen TVs and a new car every 3 or 4 years? Has it been worth the price? And you can see that people early on were questioning. So here you're seeing a painting by Philip James de Luthenberg, who made a painting of Colebrook Grove by night. So you can see that this is early on in the Industrial Revolution. You're seeing the probably production of iron using coal, and it's fiery. The atmosphere there is dark and light at the same time. So you can see why, as an artist, he was drawn to all of this fire in the middle of the night. But you also see all kinds of rubbish in the foreground. You see piles of whatever they're working on in the background. This does not look like a pleasant place to live. But this place is producing all of those goods that we need and love, right? Which is why people like John Constable, we've seen this one before. You may remember the Hay Wain. Do you remember what artistic school he belonged to? If you said Romantic, you got that correct. He idealized this type of atmosphere. So here you have, very similar, local activity, but one in which there's no pollution, there's no garbage. It's bucolic and beautiful. The cottage is overgrown in ivy instead of overgrown in smoke. It's like heaven on earth. And the Romantics said, well, wait a minute, what are we doing to people, and what are we doing to our environment? What are we doing to nature as we industrialize? Maybe we need to be a little more careful about that. And then you get to today, and you see images of climate change, or if you prefer, alleged climate change. Regardless, plastic has had huge, immense benefits to our daily lives, to so many aspects of our daily lives. And yet, it's come at a great cost. And so people are wondering, and places are now banning things like plastic bags. That won't stop climate change, but it would have helped this poor bird who was killed by a plastic bag. So these are ongoing issues that we wrestle with this Industrial Revolution starting in the late 1700s into the 1800s. Here's a big picture question. How has our experience with the Industrial Revolution changed our perception of human nature? In other words, did the Industrial Revolution make us better people? Did it reveal us for who we are? Did it make us worse people? I mean, you've heard some of the same questions. You've grown up with social media, and adults are always telling you so much of the social media is so bad. Don't use TikTok. Don't use Snapchat. Everyone's so awful on there. It's all awfulness. It's just making us worse and worse people. Is the technology making us worse people, or is it revealing the fallenness and the terribleness that's already within us, and that all it's doing ultimately is multiplying us? And even when you look at those like Al Gore, who did win multiple awards for his documentary about climate change, what does it say about human nature that even with him knowing what climate change was doing to the planet, he still owned an immense mansion, burning immense electricity, traveled on private jets all over the world to pick up his awards, traveled in large limousines, SUVs, And the way he made himself feel better about that is by buying carbon offsets. He was wealthy enough that he could pay his way through that. Buying a carbon offset does not really, ultimately, at the end of the day, change the fact that you're burning fossil fuels at an immense rate. So, who are we? Are any of us willing to make the sacrifices that would actually be necessary to change the climate? Giving up personal pets, starting to use public transportation. Or is it something that the Industrial Revolution has been so powerful to us that because it reveals ultimately our great selfish desire for comfort and pleasure, and there's no stopping it? Something to think about. All right, so let's talk about into some context of the Industrial Revolution. Remember, context is all of the things kind of before and around that help impact what's going on at that time. So, we know European trade and economic activity had been improving, not at a straight line or a parabola. It had been going up and down. There had been various times of good times and bad times. But by and large, trade and economic activity have been improving since the late Middle Ages. The Age of Discovery, going around Africa, the development of the Portuguese Empire, and then the Spanish Empire, and then the French and British Empire, and then the Dutch getting into it, will mean that there's increasing wealth in Europe, economic activity, local craftsmen are increasing. You're starting to see the growth of a middle class, the bourgeois class, who has more money than you've ever seen non-nobles have before. But we're not quite seeing the Industrial Revolution. We are seeing industrial activity. That is, people were making more things and they were selling more things, but they weren't necessarily. We weren't seeing this transformation from small factories, small workshops, to centralized factory based upon steam power, steam created by burning immense amounts of coal. So what happens? Well, Great Britain happens, or as we now will call it, the United Kingdom of Great Britain. Here's a quick check. Do you remember why we start referring to the United Kingdom as the United Kingdom in the 1700s? As before, we usually referred it to simply as England or Great Britain, not as the United Kingdom. What happened? If you said the Act of Union in 1707 unified the crowns of England and Scotland into a single crown instead of having the dual crown. Remember all the Stuarts? James I was not simply James I. James I and James VI, I believe. He was James VI of Scotland, James I of England. Well, from then on, 1707, the United Kingdom had a unified crown under one person, including Wales with that. So many other places had those exact same things, yet they didn't see the Industrial Revolution. So probably that is limited, but certainly that was necessary. You had to kind of have those things to have it. Technological skills. The people of England were in general good worksmen. They were innovative, they were creative, and they had a lot of the technological skills they'd already picked up in the Agricultural Revolution, and attitudes of technological change in the Agricultural Revolution that they will apply to the Industrial Revolution. They also had a growing supply of textile goods, things like cotton, that they could use in constructing their textile plants. We'll find that textiles are the place that you'll need to have where the Industrial Revolution takes place. So the first factories will be textile factories. You may remember that from our in-class simulation. We'll also see that England had a much more mobile social structure. The next bullet point, a mobile social structure, that it was easier for people to move around. Yes, you couldn't easily become a noble, but you could go from being a peasant to inventing something to becoming a bourgeois. That was something that was possible, that you weren't trapped. You in some parts of Europe, especially Eastern Europe, you still had serfs who were bound to the soil, who could not do that, who literally could not become bourgeois. They were always stuck to the soil, stuck as farmers. Their families would always be farmers. England did not have that. And so their populace was free to move around, was free to go where the opportunities were, go to where the jobs were. So even if you weren't an inventor, you'd go find a factory job in one of these new factory towns. Growth of the Atlantic economy will be huge. England, by this point, was becoming dominant in the Atlantic economy. They had vanquished the Spanish and the French and the Dutch. Their navy was the most powerful. So all of the trade across the Atlantic, and increasingly now with India and other parts of Asia, was seeing the next bullet point, the growth of foreign and domestic markets. That there were people around the world and within England itself who wanted to buy things. They wanted to buy British goods. They wanted to buy anything that could be produced. So that will further spur the British economy and industrial revolution. Growth of the textile industry, which I already alluded to. You had a growing supply of things like cotton cloth. That cotton cloth coming from places like the United States, especially starting in the 1800s. So the growth of the textile industry will be a part of that. It was an industry England had already been involved with wool, for hundreds of years. And so they already had expertise in that. And now it's just a matter of taking the expertise and perfecting it. They also had the strong navy. This is coming out of especially the wars, the Napoleonic Wars, the French Revolutionary Wars. England's navy was unsurpassed anywhere in the world, and they had the ability and the willingness to protect their trade routes and their sources of raw materials and their markets. Well, what about France? France should have been the country that had the Industrial Revolution. They had more people, they had more resources, they had more money, but France was hampered by the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. They'd come out as losers in that. Yes, they were still one of the strongest countries in Europe, but they lost most of their empire. They were not as heavily involved in worldwide trade. Their banking system was way behind. That ultimately it set them behind the British in advancing. Although France will catch up fairly quickly, or attempt to catch up to Great Britain very quickly. Another interesting aspect of this is, in the start of the 1770s, the English got really interested in building canals. They started building canals everywhere. England's a relatively flat country. Most of England is close to the sea. So it didn't take much to build canals to connect almost every significant town to a river that connected to the sea. So this canal boom will create a transportation system that's already in place as industrialization starts picking up. And if you're going to have access to international markets, you have to have the transportation system. So they had the navy, plus the canals, access to the sea. All of that will lead to this, or add to this industrial revolution. They also had, and we talked about this last unit, a strangely responsible and innovative nobility. These were not nobles that were always stuck in the past, who were always like, well, this is the way we used to do it, we're always going to do it this way. Or like many of the Spanish nobility who felt like being involved in business was somehow unseemly, was ungentlemanly. They were willing to innovate, they were willing to invest in these new enterprises and make money off of them. Also very important is they had stable government. You know, when you look at a country like Russia, which had immense natural resources, one of the big things they will lack is that stable government. Some parts of Europe who also had resources, like Germany, they didn't even have a unified government. The United Kingdom, by 1707, they have a unified Isle of Great Britain under one king, under one parliament, and from 1688 on, their government will be stable. They will not have a revolution. There'll be revolutions throughout the 1800s. The French Revolution, and then you'll see revolutions in 1830, revolutions in 1848. Those revolutions won't touch England, and they will remain a stable government, and stability breeds economic activity. Another important part of this is the rule of law. The British had developed one of the fairest, most unbiased legal systems the world had ever seen. They believed in what's called the rule of law, that law is above person. And we saw that with things like the Glorious Revolution, but all going back to the Magna Carta, the idea that individuals are not above the law. Every individual must obey the law is vital, again, to economic growth. If you think you have an invention and people are going to steal it because the law will not be on your side, then you're not as likely to invent something. If you believe you create a factory and the government will seize it from you, then again, you're not as willing to innovate. So the rule of law and people trusting that the law would protect their property rights was an important part of Great Britain's Industrial Revolution. And lastly, so this is one where if you're an economic a liberal of the Adam Smith School, Great Britain had some of the least amount of economic regulations. That there were no internal tariffs. If you traded something from London to Bristol, you weren't paying a tariff to move it from place to place. There were little regulations on creating new things. There were little regulations on labor, little regulations on all of these things, and that ultimately will make it possible to innovate. When there are too many regulations, it's difficult to innovate. It's expensive to innovate. It's dangerous to innovate because the regulations might ultimately take away what you're doing. So that's why the UK. That will end this lesson. What do you think? Which of these was the most important of the factors that led to United Kingdom leading the Industrial Revolution? All right, well, thank you, and we'll see you again.